Every year on the 5th of November, the village of Old Wendover gathered on the windswept moor to light the great bonfire. Children darted through the dusk, their sparklers trailing golden arcs, their laughter mingling with the crackle of kindling. The flames roared upward, clawing at the sky, and the effigy of Guy Fawkes, stuffed with straw, clad in tattered breeches, and crowned with a lopsided hat, writhed on the pyre. It was tradition, older than memory, older than names, woven into the bones of the village like the roots of the ancient yews that guarded its churchyard. But this year something felt different. Thomas Reed, the village historian, stood at the edge of the crowd, his scarf pulled tight against the biting wind. His grey eyes, sharp despite his 60 years, squinted through wire-rimmed spectacles at the fire. The villagers' cheers rang hollow in his ears. He wasn't convinced it was only Guy Fawkes they were burning. Something deeper stirred beneath the celebration, something ancient, restless, and watchful. For the past year, Thomas had buried himself in the crumbling archives of St. Cuthbert's Church, piecing together fragments of Old Wendover's past. He'd pored over parish records, their pages brittle as autumn leaves, and deciphered faded manuscripts, Druidic hymns, Celtic ogham scratched on vellum, and obscure saints' tales copied by monks long dead. What he'd found unsettled him. The fire festivals of November 5th were not merely about Parliament and treason, nor even about the gunpowder plot of 1605. They echoed a darker, older rhythm, one that pulsed through the land itself. Long before gunpowder and plots, the Celts had called this night Samhain, the hinge of the year, when the light half gave way to the dark. A festival of shadows, when the veil between worlds grew thin. Bonfires then were not just for warmth or revelry. They were offerings to coax the sun's return after winter's grip. They were wards, lit to hold back the restless spirits who wandered in the dark. Spirits of the forgotten, the betrayed, the unavenged. The fires were a pact, a promise that the living would remember. Thomas glanced at the effigy, now fully engulfed. Its straw limbs blackened, and the crowd roared as sparks spiraled into the night. But a cold wind sliced through the smoke, carrying a whisper that made his skin prickle. In the shadows beyond the fire, he thought he saw something move, something tall, robed in cinders, its eyes like twin embers. It stood motionless, watching. He blinked, and it was gone. Superstition, he told himself, shaking his head. Samhain had long been tamed, folded into All Saints' Day, a Christian festival to honor the holy dead. The gunpowder plot, for all its treachery, had become a patriotic spectacle, remembered with fireworks and cheer. Yet, as the firelight danced over the weathered stones of the moor and the shadows deepened, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this celebration wasn't entirely theirs anymore. The moor, the fire, the night, they belonged to something older. That night, sleep eluded him. The wind howled outside his cottage, rattling the shutters, and the memory of that cinder-robed figure gnawed at his mind. Unable to rest, he pulled on his coat and boots and wandered back to the moor. The village was silent, its windows dark, its cobbled streets empty. The air was sharp with frost, and the stars burned cold overhead. The bonfire had burned low, its coals pulsing like a heartbeat in the dark. The wind had stilled, and the silence was oppressive, as if the moor itself held its breath. Thomas approached the fire's remains, his boots crunching on frost-rimmed grass. The effigy was gone, reduced to ash, but the stones encircling the fire, ancient, moss-covered, and half-buried, seemed to hum with a faint, unnatural warmth. Then he saw them. Figures, faint and flickering like smoke, stood around the embers. There were perhaps a dozen, their forms wavering as if caught between worlds. Some wore rough-spun cloaks, their edges frayed by centuries. Others donned tattered cassocks, their crosses glinting faintly in the firelight. One, a woman with hollow eyes, clutched a rosary of blackened bone. Their faces were indistinct, blurred as if by fog, but their presence chilled Thomas to the marrow. At their center stood a figure taller than the rest, his face hidden behind a crude mask of red-painted wood, carved into a devil's grin. Horns curled from its brow, and its eyes were empty sockets that seemed to drink the light. "Why do you summon us, keeper of memory?" the masked figure asked, its voice like leaves skittering over frost. Thomas's breath caught. "I didn't summon anyone," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Oh, but you did," the figure said, raising a bony hand toward the coals. The embers flared briefly, casting jagged shadows. By lighting the fire, by remembering the old names, by standing on sacred ground on this sacred night. Thomas looked down, his heart pounding. The stones around the fire were not random. They formed a circle, each one carved with Ogham ancient Celtic script, weathered but unmistakable. He had walked this moor countless times, yet he had never noticed them before. This was no mere bonfire site. It was a druid circle, older than the village, older than Christendom. "You lit the fire," the masked one said, stepping closer. Its mask seemed to shift, the grin widening. "Now we ask a boon." "What kind of boon?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling. "A name," said another figure, a man in a scorched monk's robe, his voice soft but heavy with longing. "One to remember." "One to burn?" The wind returned, colder now, swirling ash into spirals that danced like ghosts. Thomas realized these spirits were neither malevolent nor benevolent. They were something else, old, forgotten, caught in the liminal space between worlds. Saints whose shrines had crumbled, martyrs whose names had been struck from records, rebels whose causes had been buried with their bones. They were the dead remembered by no one, and their hunger for recognition was a weight on the air. "I have no names to give," Thomas said, his hands shaking. The masked one tilted its head, the wooden grin unyielding. "Then give your own." Thomas froze, his breath clouding in the frigid air. The other figures drew closer, their eyes, those that had eyes, fixed on him. The woman with the bone rosary reached out, her fingers brushing his sleeve, and he felt a jolt of cold so deep it burned. Panic surged, but something in him resisted. He was the village historian, the keeper of its stories. If he could not give a name, who could? He thought of the records he'd studied, the gaps in the parish rolls where names had been erased. One had haunted him for months, a blank space in the ledger of 1623, where a man's name had been scraped away, his crime recorded only as heresy and rebellion. The village had burned him in effigy that November 5th, but his story had been lost. "Elias Cartwright," Thomas said, his voice steady now. His name was Elias Cartwright. The spirits paused. The coals flared, casting a red glow that illuminated the circle of stones. In the smoke, a figure took shape, a man shackled at the wrists, his eyes wild with defiance. His clothes were tattered, but he clutched a book bound in red leather, its pages singed but intact. His face was gaunt, his beard streaked with ash, but there was a fire in him that the centuries had not extinguished. "Let him be remembered," the spirits intoned, their voices blending into a low chant. let the fire keep him. The masked figure raised its hand, and the vision of Elias Cartwright dissolved into the smoke. The other spirits followed, fading like mist at dawn. The coals dimmed, and the moor fell silent once more. Thomas awoke on the frost-covered grass, his body aching, his beard crusted with ice. The bonfire was gone, leaving only a ring of blackened stones. The sky was grey with the promise of dawn. In his hand, clutched so tightly his knuckles ached, was a scrap of red leather, its edges charred. Embossed on it was a single word: Veritas. Back in his cottage, Thomas lit a candle and opened the parish records with trembling hands. He turned to the page for 1623, where the blank space had been. There, in neat ink, as if it had always been, was the name Elias Cartwright. Beside it, a brief entry: condemned for heresy and rebellion, burned in effigy, November 5th, 1623. Carried a book of truths, bound in red. Thomas's breath caught. He had not written those words. He had not seen that entry before. Yet there it was, undeniable. He spent the next year researching Elias Cartwright, piecing together fragments from other archives. Elias had been a scholar, a man of dangerous ideas, who had preached against the church's corruption and the crown's tyranny. His book, Veritas, had been burned with his effigy, its contents deemed too subversive to survive. But his name, at least, had been restored. The following November 5th, Thomas stood on the moor as the village gathered once more. The bonfire was lit, and the children waved their sparklers. But this year, the villagers placed not one, but two effigies on the pyre. One was Guy Fawkes, as always, his straw face grinning beneath a tattered hat. The other was different. It wore a scholar's robe, stuffed with straw and old parchment. In its hands was a crude replica of a book, painted red. The villagers called it simply the Forgotten, though Thomas alone knew its true name. As the flames consumed the effigies, the crowd cheered, but Thomas watched the shadows. He saw no cinder-robed figures, no masked devils. Yet the wind carried a whisper, faint but clear, Veritas. And in the years that followed, Old Wendover's bonfire grew brighter, its flames fiercer, as if fueled by something more than wood and straw. The village thrived, its harvests bountiful, its winters kind, and the stones of the Druid circle, once hidden, were never again overlooked. But Thomas Reed, keeper of memory, never forgot the price of a name, or the power of a fire lit on sacred ground. Many thanks for treading this tale's dark path. If its chill gripped you, like, follow, subscribe, and comment below.